Ayanna arrived at Fort Bishop without ceremony. The sun was still low, the sky streaked with faint lavender as she stepped out of the transport vehicle. No entourage, no briefing team, just a single driver who nodded and disappeared. She adjusted her cap and surveyed the base. It wasn't her first. It wouldn't be her last. But there was something about this one that felt heavy, almost reluctant to accept her presence. Inside the registration building, the atmosphere was rigid. Paperwork slid across desks. Eyes slid across her body. One receptionist pretended to check her credentials a second time. Another whispered to a nearby corporal who then burst into stifled laughter. When she asked for directions to the officer's mess, she was pointed in the wrong direction twice. Ayanna said nothing. She observed. As she made her way to the temporary barracks, she passed clusters of soldiers in various states of repose, smoking, lifting weights, chatting under tents. Each time she walked by, conversations stalled. Shoulders straightened. Some nodded respectfully, others scoffed as soon as she turned away. She made a mental note of their names even when they didn't offer them. That evening, she dined alone in the officer's mess. Despite an entire hall filled with chatter, the table around her remained empty. She ate slowly, unfazed by the isolation. This wasn't unfamiliar. It was tradition. Later that night, as she unpacked in her quarters, a low knock landed on her door. A young lieutenant stood awkwardly, holding a clipboard and avoiding eye contact. He told her the general wanted her at a briefing the next morning, but not as a speaker. As an observer. She accepted the request, thanked him, and closed the door. Then she opened her suitcase, pulled out her regulation blues, and laid out a small velvet box containing 2 silver stars. She hadn't yet worn them in public. But she would. Soon. The next morning began before dawn. Soldiers buzzed with urgency, running drills and barking orders. Ayanna showed up at the strategy briefing as instructed, unadorned, unannounced. The general barely acknowledged her presence. When she attempted to offer input on a flawed coordination plan, her comments were dismissed by a junior officer who suggested she let the real commanders handle this. No one corrected him. She stood in the back of the room, arms crossed, watching as outdated assumptions and mismatched units were justified with jargon and arrogance. The room reeked of overconfidence. Every time she opened her mouth, someone interrupted. Every time she made a point, someone reframed it as their own. It was a symphony of disrespect masquerading as procedure. During lunch, she sat outside under the shade of a tree away from the mess hall. A few junior soldiers passed by and whispered. One pointed. Another laughed. From the way they moved, she could tell they'd been told about the woman in the wrong uniform who thought she was part of the command. That afternoon, a supply issue escalated into a logistical failure. The wrong fuel was being routed to inactive vehicles and critical gear was delayed due to a paperwork mismatch. She reported the oversight to logistics control. They nodded, ignored it. By evening, the base was in chaos, and Ayanna watched from her barracks window, her expression unreadable. 2 days later, a training exercise was scheduled involving artillery, drone recon, and ground maneuvers. Ayanna was assigned to observe from the northern hill, unarmed, without headset or input device. As if she were a cadet, she accepted it without protest. The operation began smoothly on paper. But within an hour, signals were scrambled, a drone went off-grid, and 2 teams mistakenly engaged each other in a mock firefight that left one cadet with a fractured femur. Medics swarmed the zone. Radios blared confusion. Ayanna, still on the hill, had been silently tracking every misstep. She approached the control tent uninvited, lifting the flap and stepping inside. Dozens of eyes turned. The room froze. She calmly walked to the digital map and pointed out 3 errors, 2 procedural violations, and 1 forgotten protocol that could have cost real lives. A young captain scoffed, told her to leave. The room agreed. She left without a word. But she didn't go back to her quarters. She entered a secure room, opened a laptop, and initiated a direct-line video call. The screen flickered, and soon the Secretary of Defense appeared. After a coded exchange, she sent her field report. Then, she waited. At 5 o'clock the next morning, a black convoy arrived at the base gates. Uniforms snapped to attention as high command stepped out of the SUVs. Among them, 3 generals, 1 civilian executive, and a press correspondent. The air changed instantly. Everyone who had once smirked now stiffened. The general who had dismissed Ayanna stood pale at the gate. Then she emerged from the final vehicle. Now in full dress uniform, medals polished, twin stars gleaming on her shoulders. Her ID no longer hung from a plastic lanyard. It was now in a gold-trimmed badge clipped near her heart. Silence overtook the base. She walked past rows of rigid soldiers, her boots now louder than theirs. She approached the main podium. The general tried to step forward to speak. He was stopped. One of the visiting officers stepped up and announced the new field commander of Fort Bishop. Commander Ayanna Briggs. Gasps echoed. One man dropped his pen. A woman let out a soft "oh my God" under her breath. Ayanna didn't smile. She simply nodded and stepped forward, delivering her first orders with clarity and finality. Every officer in the room saluted, and for the first time no one questioned her uniform. The air in Fort Bishop had shifted. It was no longer thick with smirks and doubt. Now it was dense with silence, an unsettling hush that settled over the base like fog. Eyes no longer avoided her. Now they followed her every step with something far more complicated than curiosity. Some gazes held shame, others guilt, a few resentment, but none dared speak. Commander Ayanna Briggs moved with quiet authority. She didn't bark. She didn't pace. She observed. She listened, and when she spoke, the room moved. Orders were given with precision. Meetings were conducted with efficiency. No wasted motion. No empty gestures. The same officers who once questioned her presence now took notes when she dissected operations. The men who dismissed her corrections now stayed behind after briefings, hoping to redeem themselves with unnecessary suggestions or sheepish affirmations. She didn't indulge them. She had no interest in revenge, only in results. Within days, inefficiencies were slashed. A failed logistics chain was restructured under her command. Troop readiness improved. She implemented simulation reviews, restructured sleep cycles, and quietly disciplined underperformers, not with humiliation, but by assigning them to night duties and logistics audits. Rumors started to circulate, not of her failures, but of her past. Whispers emerged in the mess hall and under barracks lights, that she had once commanded a humanitarian airlift during a Civil War evacuation, that she de-escalated a hostage situation with no casualties, that she had trained with special forces and completed 3 overseas rotations under blackout status. None of these were in her initial personnel file on base. No one had bothered to check the full record. Now they scrambled to learn what they had ignored, and what they found changed everything. Still, Ayanna did not seek validation. She remained focused on the mission, but even she could not prevent what came next. A senior officer, Colonel Hensley, filed an anonymous complaint with regional command. He claimed she had bypassed protocol, that she was exerting undue pressure on male officers, that her background had been fast-tracked. The report was vague, thin, and rooted in discomfort, not evidence. She saw it for what it was, a final grasp at control from a man who had lost his position not because of her, but because of his own mediocrity. The investigation didn't last long. The Secretary of Defense himself sent a 2-word reply. Fully authorized. With that, the resistance collapsed. By the 3rd week of her command, the base had transformed. Morning drills started on time. Supply deliveries hit target. Response simulations were completed with 20% greater accuracy. Not because of fear, but clarity. Leadership was no longer about asserting dominance. It was about earning it. Ayanna had done both. She walked through the barracks and was no longer met with silence, but with purpose. The soldiers stood taller not just because of her presence, but because of how she carried them forward. She made them believe they were better than how they had acted, that they could rise above what they had been trained to dismiss. A new lieutenant approached her outside the strategy tent one afternoon. His posture was tense, his eyes heavy with something unsaid. He fumbled at first, then finally managed a few words, not apology, but something adjacent. She accepted it not with a nod, but with a direct order to report to her unit for overnight field logistics. Not as punishment, but immersion. Growth wasn't given. It was earned. In the coming weeks, she initiated a quiet but radical change to the officer training program. Diversity audits, cultural humility seminars, case study reviews from past command failures, including this very base. It wasn't public. It didn't make headlines, but the ripple would spread through the system. Then came the ceremony. It was a simple flag change routine for a new commander. But when Ayanna stood at the podium beneath the setting sun, dozens of soldiers stood in full dress. More than required. Voluntarily. And when she began to speak, formally acknowledging her role, the mistakes made, and the standards that would define them moving forward, there was no scoffing. No sideways glances. Only silence, respect, and a few eyes blinking back the weight of recognition. The camera crews came, of course. Someone leaked the story of how a woman in the wrong uniform had become a national example of silent discipline and strategic force. Journalists wanted interviews. Authors offered book deals. Even the president requested a private conversation. She declined the media, accepted the call. One evening, alone in her quarters, she opened her locker. Inside hung the original uniform, the one she wore the day she arrived. The one they said wasn't hers. It still smelled faintly of dust and doubt. She took it out, folded it carefully, and placed it in a cedar box. Not to forget what had been said, but to remember what she proved wrong. And as she turned off the lights and stepped into the night air, the stars on her shoulder reflected the base lights below like twin beacons. She was no longer questioned. She was the commander.